The clock on the microwave read 6:42 a.m. when I saw her. The light was still that thin, gray mountain version of dawn, more of a suggestion than a full statement. I was standing at my kitchen window, holding a mug of coffee that was just cool enough to drink, watching the steam curl up and fog a little circle on the glass. This was my ritual: coffee, window, quiet. It was the foundation of my day, the moment of peace before the world woke up. And then I saw her, standing on my property like she'd been invited. She hadn't. It was Carol. Of course it was Carol. She was the president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association, a title she wore like a royal mantle. She was not alone. Flanking her were what I had come to think of as her acolytes, a half-dozen residents wrapped in fluffy white bathrobes, their faces a mixture of righteous indignation and spa-day anticipation. Carol herself was not in a robe. She was in what she probably considered a power outfit: a lurid pink tracksuit, crisp white sneakers, and a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. In her other hand, she held a pair of bright yellow bolt cutters. They looked comically large and menacing in the gentle morning light. They were standing at the head of the stone path that led from the edge of my lawn down a gentle slope to the small cedar-framed structure that housed my hot spring. My private hot spring. I watched, not moving from my window. I didn't run outside. I didn't shout. I simply took a slow sip of my coffee and observed. This was not the first move in the game, but it was certainly the most flagrant. She was making a statement. She was moving from passive-aggressive notices tucked under my door to active, physical trespass. She had no idea what a mistake she was making. She said something to her followers, a gesture with the clipboard, and they nodded eagerly. Then she strode to the small wooden gate at the start of the path. It was a simple gate, more symbolic than anything, with a modest brass lock. It was there to say, "This is a threshold. This is private." She lifted the bolt cutters. The metal jaws opened, glinting even in the weak light. That's when I moved. I set my coffee mug down on the counter with a quiet click. I picked up my phone from its charging dock. I walked to the back door, slid it open, and stepped out onto my patio. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. I didn't say a word. I just stood there and started recording. The sound of my door sliding open carried in the still air. Carol froze, the bolt cutters hovering over the lock. Her head snapped in my direction. A flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossed her face before it settled back into her mask of imperious authority. "Arthur," she said, her voice carrying across the lawn, sharp and unpleasant. "It's about time you came out. We are here to conduct a community wellness audit." I remained silent. I kept the phone steady, my thumb resting near the volume button, a habit from years of recording lectures and depositions. "Keep your hands quiet. Let the subject fill the space." "As you have been notified," she continued, her voice growing louder as if I were hard of hearing, "the board has determined that this geothermal feature is a community asset. Your refusal to grant access to your fellow residents, many of whom suffer from arthritis and other ailments, is a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the Whispering Pines Covenant." She was good. I had to give her that. She had a certain talent for weaving a tapestry of nonsense that sounded almost plausible if you weren't listening closely. Community wellness audit, geothermal feature, spirit of the covenant. It was a masterpiece of performative bureaucracy. I took a single step forward, making sure the phone's microphone could pick up her words clearly. I still said nothing. My silence seemed to infuriate her more than any argument could. "We have voted," she declared, tapping the clipboard with a manicured finger. "The Community Wellness and Shared Resources Committee has voted to open the spring for therapeutic use on a trial basis. We will be installing a new community-accessible gate. You will be billed for the cost." She held up the bolt cutters. "This is your final chance to comply peacefully, Arthur. Open the gate." One of the women in the bathrobes, a Mrs. Gable from down the street, shifted uncomfortably. "Carol, maybe we should just wait," she began, her voice a nervous whisper. Carol shot her a look that could curdle milk. "Quiet, Janice. This is a board action." I finally spoke. My voice was low, calm. "Carol," I said, and her name hung in the air, a simple fact. "You are on my property. You are trespassing. You are holding a tool with the expressed intent of destroying my private property. I am advising you to leave immediately." She laughed. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound. "Your property, Arthur. We are a community. That word means something. It means we share. You are hoarding a natural resource that belongs to everyone. Now, I am the president of this homeowners association. I am ordering you to stand down, or I will have you fined for obstruction and call the sheriff to have you removed. It was perfect. It was all on camera. The threat, the identification of her role, the baseless assertion of authority, the clear statement of intent. It was a gift. I lowered my phone slightly, though it was still recording. I looked directly at her, past the clipboard and the bolt cutters and the pink tracksuit. I let a long, quiet moment pass. The birds were starting to sing in the pines around us. You have no idea, I said softly, almost to myself, but loud enough for her to hear. You have no idea what you've just done. I turned, slid my door shut behind me, and locked it. I walked back to my kitchen counter, picked up my coffee, and took a sip. It was still warm. Through the window, I watched her hesitate for a moment. The bolt cutters lowered. Then, fueled by the stares of her audience, her resolve hardened. The jaws of the cutters closed around the brass lock. She had no idea she had just declared a war she could not possibly win. A war against paper, and I was the one who printed the maps. But before I tell you what I did next, before I explain the precise and methodical disassembly of Carol's little empire, I should probably explain how we got here. It's important to understand the foundation of the thing. Every structure, be it a house, an argument, or a legal case, stands or falls on its foundation. Carol's was built on sand. Mine was built on bedrock, documented in triplicate. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am a retired hydrogeologist. For 35 years, I worked for the State Water Resources Board. My job, in simple terms, was to understand where the water was, where it was going, and who had the right to use it. I spent my life reading topographical maps, studying geological surveys, and most importantly, interpreting the dense, labyrinthine legal code that governs water rights. I was, for lack of a better term, a professional rule knower. I didn't make the rules. I just knew them, inside and out. It was a quiet profession, suited to my temperament. I prefer observation to participation. My wife, Eleanor, was the opposite. She was the participant. She was the one who found this piece of land, an odd, pie-shaped lot at the very edge of the planned Whispering Pines development, 30 years ago. The developer was having trouble selling it because of the steep grade at the back and the rocky, unusable patch where the earth was always warm and damp. But Eleanor, a botanist, saw what he didn't. She walked me out to that damp patch, knelt down, and put her hands on the earth. "Feel that, Artie?" she'd said, her eyes alight. "That's a gift." She was right. It was a natural hot spring, a small, anonymous fissure from the geothermal activity deep below our mountains. It wasn't large, just a steady, bubbling upwelling of 104-degree water rich in minerals. For the developer, it was a liability. For us, it was paradise. We bought the lot for a song. The deed was clear. It included the entire parcel, right up to the jagged rock face that marked the property line, well past the spring itself. I checked the water rights myself, a professional habit. They were unregistered, unclaimed, so I filed. I went through the months-long process of documenting the flow rate, the mineral content, the geological source. I filed the paperwork with the state, the same office where I worked. It was all perfectly legal, fully documented. On paper, that spring and its water were as much a part of my property as the front door of my house. Eleanor designed the bathhouse. It wasn't grand. Just a small, Japanese-inspired structure of cedar and glass, built to be a part of the landscape, not to dominate it. We spent our weekends there, soaking in the warm water, watching the stars. It was our sanctuary. After she passed away 5 years ago, it became my memorial to her. I kept it exactly as she'd designed it, a quiet testament to a shared life. I was living a quiet, solitary life. I bothered no one, and for years, no one bothered me. Then came Carol. She and her husband moved in about 3 years back. She wasn't elected HOA president right away. At first, she was just a busybody, the kind of person who measures the height of her neighbor's grass with a ruler. The previous board was a relaxed group of old-timers, more concerned with organizing the annual potluck than enforcing the letter of the covenant. But they were aging, and one by one, they moved away to be closer to their children. Carol saw the power vacuum and filled it. She ran for the board on a platform of restoring property values and enforcing the standards we all agreed to. She won, and then, through a series of procedural maneuvers and by stacking the board with her allies, she had herself named president. That's when the notices started. Mrs. Gable, the nervous woman in the bathrobe, was fined $200 because her wind chimes were deemed an auditory nuisance. Mr. Henderson down the street got a $500 fine and a demand to remove the small garden shed he'd had for 20 years, because it hadn't been pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee, a committee Carol had just invented and appointed herself the sole member of. The fines were always for petty, subjective things. A wreath left on a door too long after Christmas. A garbage can left out 2 hours past the designated time. I watched it all, and I started a file. It was a simple manila folder at first. I labeled it HOA. Every notice, every threatening newsletter, every payment I made went into that folder. Oh yes, I paid. I got my own share of notices. My mailbox, a sturdy, unassuming black box, was apparently not the approved shade of bronze. $100. I paid it by check. My garden hose was visible from the street. $50. I paid it. I never argued. I never protested. Arguing with people like Carol is pointless. They don't operate on logic. They operate on emotion and power. Arguing gives them the confrontation they crave. It validates their authority. Silence and compliance, on the other hand, are confusing to them. But I wasn't just complying. I was documenting. Every check I wrote was a canceled check. Every notice was a piece of evidence. I kept the receipts. I kept copies of everything. My folder grew thicker. It became 2 folders, then a full-fledged accordion file. I wasn't planning a war. I was simply a man who believed in keeping good records. It was my nature. The spring became an issue about 6 months before the bolt cutter incident. Carol was doing one of her neighborhood beautification walkthroughs, which was really just an excuse to prowl around people's yards with her clipboard, looking for infractions. She saw me on my back patio and invited herself over, claiming she needed to inspect the rear-facing elements of my home. She walked across my lawn, her eyes scanning everything, and then she saw it, the steam rising from the bathhouse roof vent. "What's that?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "That's my bathhouse," I said politely. "A bathhouse?" She walked to the head of the stone path, peering down. "You have a pool?" I said. "It's a hot spring." The words hung in the air. I could see the gears turning in her head. The acquisitive gleam in her eye was unmistakable. It was the look of a conquistador discovering a city of gold. "A natural hot spring?" she said, her voice dripping with a sudden, cloying sweetness. "How wonderful. A true community treasure." "It's a private spring on private property," I said, my tone firm but still polite. She just smiled. It was a thin, predatory smile. "Of course, Arthur, of course." She made a note on her clipboard. I knew in that moment that this would not be the end of it. She had no idea how right I was. She had just put my quiet, private sanctuary on her list of things to conquer. And in doing so, she had unwittingly opened a file in my mind, a file far deeper and more organized than the one in my desk drawer. The file labeled Carol. The first salvo was a letter. It arrived in a crisp, HOA-branded envelope. It was a formal request for me to submit a shared use plan for the geothermal asset located on Lot 7B. The letter was a masterpiece of corporate speak, full of phrases like leveraging community resources and promoting holistic wellness. It was signed by Carol as president and the entire Community Wellness and Shared Resources Committee, which I knew consisted of herself and 2 of her closest sycophants. I did not reply with a shared use plan. I replied with a formal, written warning. It was a simple, 1-page letter, but I drafted it as carefully as I would have a legal brief. I am a great believer in the power of putting things on paper. An argument is just noise. A document is a fact. I went to my office, a room lined with books on geology and law, and sat at my old oak desk. I pulled out a sheet of heavy bond paper. On it, I typed a clear, concise letter. It stated 3 simple facts. 1. The hot spring, its source, and all access to it were located entirely within the legal boundaries of my private property, as defined by the official plat map filed with the county recorder's office, plat number 734B. 2. I held the exclusive, registered water rights for the geothermal source, under State Water Rights docket number G881A. 3. Any attempt to access the spring, or to alter the property in any way, would be considered criminal trespass and destruction of property. I attached copies of the relevant section of my deed, the county plat map with my property lines clearly highlighted, and the front page of my state water rights certificate. I didn't send it by email, which can be deleted or claimed as never received. I didn't put it in her mailbox, where it could be casually discarded. I took it to the post office and sent it via certified mail, with return receipt requested. This is a crucial step. It creates an undeniable paper trail. For a few extra dollars, the United States Postal Service becomes your witness. They would provide me with a postcard, signed by Carol herself, proving she had received my letter. It was a simple, elegant, and legally binding piece of evidence. She could no longer claim she wasn't warned. Her response came about a week later, not to me directly, but through the community grapevine. Mr. Henderson stopped me while I was getting my mail. He looked nervous. "Arthur," he said, his voice low, "I thought you should know. At the board meeting last night, Carol, she brought up your letter." "Oh," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "She held it up," he said, wringing his hands. "She called it a threatening and selfish legal document. She said you were trying to use lawyer tricks to hoard a community resource, and then she tore it up. In front of everyone. She tore up the letter and the maps and everything. She said, 'This is what we think of selfish threats.' And people applauded, Arthur. They actually applauded." I just nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me, Mr. Henderson. I appreciate it." He looked at me, his eyes full of a kind of weary sympathy. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to get to work," I said, and I did. Her performative destruction of my warning was the final catalyst. She had escalated from inquiry to demand, and now to open contempt for the documented legal facts. She had left me no choice. The phase of quiet observation was over. The phase of proactive preparation had begun. I retreated to my office. It was no longer just a study. It was a command center. The first thing I did was call Gene. Gene had been my paralegal at the Water Resources Board for 20 years. He was younger than me, but he had a mind like a steel trap and a deep, abiding love for the minutiae of public records. He'd retired a few years after I did, but was bored out of his mind. He now ran a small private investigation and paralegal service, mostly for old colleagues who needed his particular brand of digital archaeology. "Arthur," he said, his voice booming over the phone, "don't tell me you've discovered an underground river beneath the state capitol." "Something much smaller, Gene," I said. "An HOA president with an inflated sense of her own jurisdiction." I explained the situation, the spring, Carol, the torn-up letter. Gene listened patiently. When I was done, there was a pause, and then I heard the sound of him cracking his knuckles, a sound I had heard 1,000 times before we delved into a complex case. "Oh, this is delicious," he said. "A petty tyrant with a clipboard. My favorite. What do you need?" "Everything," I said. "I want everything on the Whispering Pines Estates HOA. I want every meeting minute for the last 3 years, official and draft. I want all financial statements, budgets, and audit reports. I want the original articles of incorporation and any amendments. I want a full list of board members, past and present. And I want to know everything there is to know about a woman named Carol." "Consider it done," Gene said. "I'll start with the public records requests. It'll take a few weeks for them to comply. In the meantime, I'll do a little digging on President Carol, see if she's been a president anywhere else before." While Gene got to work on the digital side, I focused on the physical. I spent the next 2 weeks systematically assembling my own file. I drove to the county recorder's office, a dusty building downtown that smelled of old paper and ozone. I spent a day pulling not just my own deed, but the deeds of all my adjacent neighbors. I wanted to create a complete, undeniable map of ownership. I got certified copies of everything. A certified copy is a powerful thing. It's a document that a government official has attested is a true and accurate copy of the original. It carries the weight of the state. I organized it all into a series of 3-ring binders, one for property records, one for water rights, one for HHOA correspondence. I used tab dividers. I cross-referenced documents. The thick manila folder became a meticulously organized library of facts. This was not overkill. This was preparation. When you go up against someone who relies on performance and emotion, your greatest weapon is a boring, irrefutable stack of paper. You don't argue with them. You present the file. The file does the talking. It was during this process, in the dim light of a microfilm reader at the back of the county office, that I found it. The bombshell. I was looking through the original development plans for Whispering Pines, filed back in the late 1970s. I was looking for any mention of common areas or shared resources, anything Carol might try to twist. And I found something much better. I was looking at the plat for the parcel of land that would become the community clubhouse and pool. It was a large, central plot, and the documents showed it was donated to the future HOA by the developer, a man named George Mercer. But attached to the deed of donation was a covenant. Covenants are restrictions on how a piece of property can be used. They are legally binding and run with the land, meaning they apply to all future owners. The covenant on the clubhouse parcel was crystal clear. It stated that the property was to be used solely for the non-commercial recreational enjoyment of the members of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association and their accompanied guests. The key words were solely and non-commercial. My heart beat a little faster. I thought about the glossy flyers I'd seen tacked to the community bulletin board. Flyers I had dutifully photographed and filed away. Sunrise Yoga with Tiffany, $20 drop-in fee. Essential Oil Wellness Workshop, materials fee, $50. Weekend watercolor retreat with renowned local artist, open to the public. All of these events were held at the clubhouse. All were hosted by Carol. If she was collecting fees, especially from non-residents, she was engaging in commercial activity. She was violating the foundational covenant of the HOA's most valuable asset. The penalty for violating such a covenant could be severe. In the most extreme interpretation, the heirs of the original donor, George Mercer, could sue to have the land revert to them. She wasn't just breaking the rules. She was risking the very existence of the clubhouse she used as her seat of power. I paid the clerk $5 for a certified copy of the deed and its attached covenant. As I walked out of the recorder's office into the bright afternoon sun, the document felt heavy in my hand. It was more than just paper. It was leverage. It was the bedrock I had been looking for. Carol was so focused on the small patch of water in my backyard that she had no idea the ground beneath her own throne was about to give way. The next move was hers, and it was as predictable as it was foolish. 2 weeks after I found the covenant, about a month after her bolt cutter performance, she decided to force the issue again. This time, she was smarter, or so she thought. She didn't bring bolt cutters. She brought a handyman and a new gate. I was in my office, cross-referencing Jean's initial findings with my own documents, when I heard the sound of a truck idling on the street in front of my house. I looked out the front window and saw a beat-up white work van with Dave's Handyman Services painted on the side. Dave, a burly man in a dirty t-shirt, was unloading a prefabricated section of metal fencing from the back, and standing next to him, pointing and directing, was Carol. This time she wasn't trying to be subtle. This was a direct invasion. I picked up my phone and walked to the front door, recording as I went. I didn't open it. I just filmed through the glass. They walked up my driveway and onto my lawn, heading for the stone path to the spring. Carol was talking loudly to the handyman, explaining how the new community access point was to be installed. I knew what I had to do. This had moved beyond a civil disagreement. This was a direct and ongoing attempt to alter my property against my will. I called the sheriff's department. I didn't dial 911. This wasn't a life-threatening emergency. I called the non-emergency line. The dispatcher was calm and professional. Sheriff's Department, what is the location of your issue? I gave my address. I'd like to report a trespass in progress, I said, my voice steady. The president of my homeowners association, a woman named Carol, is on my private property with a contractor and is attempting to illegally install a fence. I made sure to use specific legally relevant terms: trespass, private property, illegally install. Is the individual armed or threatening? The dispatcher asked. She is not armed, I said, but she is trespassing, and she has a history of attempting to damage my property. I am concerned the situation will escalate. I would like a deputy to respond and make a report. A deputy is on their way, she said. I hung up and continued to film. A few minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up. A single deputy got out. He was young, looked to be in his late 20s, with a crisp uniform and a calm, professional demeanor. His name tag read Miller. Carol saw him and her face lit up. She saw him not as a neutral arbiter of the law, but as her own personal enforcement arm. She hurried over to meet him before he was even fully out of his car. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. Officer," she gushed, putting on her most distressed, victimized voice. The performance had begun. "This man," she said, pointing dramatically at my house, "is causing a terrible disturbance. He's a very difficult, very selfish man. He is hoarding a vital community resource, a natural healing spring, and refusing to share it with the sick and elderly residents of our community." Deputy Miller listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He had his hand resting on his belt, near his notepad. He was taking it all in. "We are simply trying to install a safe, accessible entry point for our residents, as approved by the HOA board," she continued, her voice trembling with manufactured sincerity. "And he's been so threatening, he hides in his house and watches us. I'm afraid of what he might do." It was a brilliant performance. She painted herself as the caring community leader and me as the creepy old recluse. If the deputy was swayed by emotion, she would win. Deputy Miller nodded. "Okay, ma'am, let me go talk to him." He walked up my driveway and onto my porch. I opened the door before he knocked. My phone was still in my hand, but I had stopped recording. You don't record the police unless you have a very good reason. You treat them with professional respect. "Good morning, sir," he said. "I'm Deputy Miller. I've received a call about a disturbance." "Good morning, Deputy," I said calmly. "I'm Arthur Pendleton. I'm the one who called. Thank you for coming." His eyebrows raised just a fraction. This was not what he was expecting. "You called?" "Yes," I said. "That woman—" I gestured toward Carol, who was watching us intently, "is trespassing on my property and is attempting to have a fence illegally installed. I asked her to leave, and she refused." "She's saying this is community property," Deputy Miller said, his gaze neutral. He was just stating the facts as they had been presented to him. "I understand that is what she is saying," I replied. "However, it is not correct. Would you mind coming inside for a moment? I can show you the documentation." He hesitated for a second, then nodded. "Okay." I led him into my office. The 3-ring binders were sitting neatly on my desk. I didn't overwhelm him. I didn't dump the whole file on him. Police officers are busy. You give them exactly what they need and no more. I opened the first binder, the one labeled property. "Deputy," I said, "this is a certified copy of my property deed from the county recorder's office. As you can see, it describes the full parcel. This," I pointed to a second document, "is the certified county plat map. This is my property line. The spring is located here." I tapped a spot well inside the line, and this, I opened the second binder, is a certified copy of my state-registered water rights for the geothermal source. On paper, legally, this is no different than someone trying to install a fence in my living room. He looked at the documents. He wasn't a surveyor or a lawyer, but he knew what a certified copy was. He knew what a deed was. He could see the official seals, the signatures, the plat numbers. He was looking at facts. Outside, Carol was offering feelings. There was a subtle shift in his posture. He was a professional, and he recognized a fellow professional, someone who dealt in facts and documentation. "Okay," he said slowly, nodding. "I see. I have previously sent this documentation to Mrs. Carroll via certified mail," I continued, pressing my advantage. "She is aware of these facts. I also have video of her from this morning, and from a previous incident where she attempted to destroy my gate lock with bolt cutters." His eyes widened slightly at that. "Bolt cutters?" "Yes," I said. "Deputy, I am not a threatening person. I am a retired state employee. I just want to be left alone on my own property. I would like to make an official statement for your report that Mrs. Carroll has repeatedly trespassed, has attempted to destroy my property, and has made me feel harassed and unsafe in my own home. I am formally requesting that you issue her a verbal warning for criminal trespass." I had given him everything he needed. I had shown him the law. I had demonstrated a pattern of behavior by the other party, and I had made a specific, reasonable, and legally sound request. I had made his job easy. He nodded again, this time with more conviction. "Yes, sir, I can do that." We walked back outside. Carol's smile was gone. She could see the deputy walking with me, could see the shift in the dynamic. Deputy Miller's tone was all business now. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Carol, "this is private property. The owner has presented documentation to that effect. You and your contractor need to leave the premises immediately." Carol's face turned a mottled shade of red. But the community. The board voted. "Ma'am, an HOA vote does not supersede state property law," Deputy Miller said, his voice flat and final. "This is a civil matter, but right now, you are trespassing. If you do not leave, the owner can press charges. I am advising you to leave now." He turned to the handyman. "And you, sir? I'd pack up my tools if I were you." The handyman, Dave, needed no further encouragement. He looked from the deputy to Carol to me, shrugged, and started loading the fence section back into his truck. Carol was left standing on the lawn, sputtering. Her authority had been publicly and completely undermined by a higher authority. The mask had slipped. For a moment, I saw the raw, sputtering rage beneath the veneer of the caring community leader. It was not a pleasant sight. She glared at me, a look of pure hatred. Then she spun on her heel and marched back to the street, her acolytes trailing behind her like defeated courtiers. Deputy Miller tipped his hat to me. "He'll be a report filed, Mr. Pendleton. If she comes back, you call us." "Thank you, Deputy," I said. "I appreciate your professionalism." I watched him drive away, It was a victory, but I knew it wasn't the end. I had won the battle of the lawn, but the war was far from over. People like Carol do not accept defeat. They double down, they escalate. And I knew that her next move would be to try and crush me, not with bolt cutters or handymen, but with the full misused weight of the HOA's power. I was right. But what she didn't know was that by calling the deputy, she had given me another perfect piece for my collection, an official police report that documented her trespass. Another sheet of paper for the file. The incident with Deputy Miller had an unintended, but welcome, consequence. It showed the neighborhood that Carol was not invincible. Her power was derived from the illusion of authority, and the deputy had publicly demonstrated its limits. This small crack in her facade was all the encouragement some people needed. A few evenings later, there was a tentative knock on my door. It was Mr. Henderson. He was holding a worn shoebox, looking more nervous than I had ever seen him. "Arthur," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course, George," I said, using his first name. "Come in." He stepped inside, glancing around as if Carol herself might be hiding behind my coat rack. He sat stiffly on the edge of my sofa, placing the shoebox on the coffee table as if it contained a bomb. "I saw what happened the other day," he began, "with the sheriff. That took guts." "It wasn't about guts, George," I said, sitting opposite him. "It was about documentation. Well, whatever it was, it got me thinking," he said. He pushed the shoebox forward. "Carol has been fining me for years. My shed, the color of my trim. The unapproved rose bushes my wife planted before she died. Thousands of dollars. I just paid it. I didn't want the trouble, but it was wrong." He tapped the box. "My wife, she was meticulous. She told me to record things. I didn't know why, but I did it for her." He opened the box. It was filled with dozens of micro-cassette tapes, each neatly labeled with a date. "They're recordings of the board meetings," he explained. "The public ones, of course. I just put a little recorder in my jacket pocket. It's legal in this state, as long as it's in a public meeting. I have the one where she tore up your letter. I have the one where she called you a menace to the community. And I have this." He pulled out a specific tape. It was labeled Executive Session Unofficial. This was a mistake," he said. "My recorder was still running from the public meeting when a few of them stayed behind for a closed session. They thought everyone had left. I got the whole thing." My heart quickened. This was the fearful ally, the one who held a key piece of the puzzle. "What's on it, George?" "It's Carol," he said, his eyes wide, "talking to her two cronies on the board. She's talking about you. She says, and I remember the exact words, 'We're going to fine him into oblivion. We'll put a lien on his house so fast his head will spin. That spring is going to be the centerpiece of my new wellness program, one way or another. We just have to make an example of him.'" It was the smoking gun. It showed intent. It proved that the fines and the harassment were not about enforcing rules, but about a targeted campaign to seize my property. It moved the conflict from a civil dispute over bylaws to a potential criminal conspiracy. "George," I said, my voice low and serious, "this is incredibly important. Are you willing to let me make a copy of this?" He nodded, a look of resolve finally settling on his face. "I'm tired of being afraid, Arthur. It's time someone stood up to her. Use it." The very next day, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line was simply HOA Financials. The body of the email was short. "I think you will find the attached documents illuminating. I am tired of the bullying. A concerned board member." Attached was a password-protected zip file. I had a feeling I knew who it was from. There was a woman on the board, Susan, a retired accountant. She had always seemed uncomfortable with Carol's excesses, often abstaining from the more egregious votes. She was the disillusioned insider. I sent a simple reply. "Thank you. How do I open the file?" A minute later, a new email arrived. "Eleanor." My breath caught in my throat. She had used my late wife's name as the password. It was a sign of respect, a gesture of solidarity. I typed it in, and the file opened. It contained 2 sets of financial statements for the HOA. One was the official version that was presented to the community, showing a modest, balanced budget. The other was labeled internal use only. It was the real version. The internal version showed a line item that the public one did not. Clubhouse use fees. It was a significant amount, thousands of dollars per month. But there was a second discrepancy, a far more damning one. I cross-referenced the clubhouse use fees with the bank deposit statements, which Susan had also included. The numbers didn't match. The amount of money being deposited into the HOA's bank account was consistently about 30% less than the income being recorded. The rest was simply gone. Jean's research had already turned up the fact that Carol had registered a private LLC a year ago, Wellness and Lifestyle Solutions. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. She was charging fees for her workshops, recording the full amount to justify the program to the board, depositing a portion into the HOA accounts to keep things looking legitimate, and skimming the rest into her own company. It was classic, blatant embezzlement hidden in plain sight. The coalition was forming. I had George's audio recordings. I had Susan's financial documents. I had my own mountain of legal paperwork. All the pieces were in place. And then Carol made her final desperate move. She overplayed her hand so badly it was almost tragic. A notice appeared on the community bulletin board and was hand-delivered to my front door by one of her acolytes, announcing an emergency general meeting. The purpose: to vote on the levying of a significant fine and property lien against Lot 7B for ongoing violations of community standards and failure to comply with board directives regarding shared community assets. She was trying to use the public meeting as a show of force, to humiliate me and get the community to rubber stamp her theft. She was calling for a public trial. She had no idea that I was more than ready to give her one. She thought she was the prosecutor, judge, and jury. She was about to find out she was the one in the dock. I called my lawyer. I hadn't needed one up to this point. I preferred to handle things myself. But a public meeting was a different beast. It wasn't a courtroom, but it needed to be treated with the same procedural gravity. I didn't need a litigator. I needed a performer, a master of ceremonies who could present my boring, factual evidence with the appropriate theatrical flair. I called a man named Ben Carter, a semi-retired corporate lawyer I'd played poker with for years. Ben had a silver tongue and a love for dismantling arrogant people. "Ben," I said, "I have a small project for you. It involves an HOA meeting, a stack of evidence, and a woman who desperately needs to be introduced to the concept of consequences." Ben chuckled on the other end of the line. "Arthur, you've been holding out on me. I'm in. Send me the file." I sent him everything: the binders, the audio files, the financial statements. The final escalation was here. The final confrontation was set. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. I had never seen it so full. The air was thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. Carol had set the room up like a tribunal. A long table sat at the front, where she and her two loyal board members, the Community Wellness Committee, were seated. In front of them was a single chair, placed in the center of the room like a defendant's dock. Rows of chairs for the residents were arranged in a semicircle. It was pure theater. Carol's supporters, a clutch of about 20 people, were seated together on the right side of the room, whispering amongst themselves and glaring at anyone who looked sympathetic to me. On the left side were the others: Mr. Henderson, a few other residents who had been fined and harassed, and a surprising number of neutral parties who were simply curious. Susan, the disillusioned board member, sat at the main table, her face a pale, determined mask. My lawyer, Ben Carter, and I walked in and took seats in the front row, on the left. Ben was dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He looked calm, almost cheerful, like a man looking forward to a good meal. I was in my usual quiet blazer. I carried nothing. All the ammunition we needed was in Ben's briefcase, digitized and organized. Carol banged a gavel on the table. "This emergency meeting of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association is now in session," she announced, her voice resonating with self-importance. "The sole item on the agenda is the ongoing, flagrant violation of community covenants by the resident of Lot 7B, Arthur Pendleton." She launched into her performance. It was a masterwork of manipulation. Her voice trembled as she spoke of the elderly and infirm being denied the healing waters. She painted me as a hoarder of natural beauty, a selfish recluse who was poisoning the spirit of our community. She held up blurry photos of my gate as if it were a fortress wall. "For months," she said, dabbing at a dry eye with a tissue, "your board has tried to reason with Mr. Pendleton. We have sent letters. We have made appeals to his better nature. We have been met with nothing but hostility, legal threats, and a complete disregard for his neighbors." She let that sink in. The room was silent. Her supporters nodded gravely. "Therefore," she concluded, her voice hardening, "the board proposes an immediate fine of $50,000 for failure to comply with a board directive. and for conduct detrimental to the community. Furthermore, we will move to place a lien on his property to ensure payment. This is a painful step, but we must protect the assets and the well-being of this community. A gasp went through the room. $50,000. It was an absurd, punitive number designed to crush me. We will now open the floor for a brief statement from Mr. Pendleton, after which the board will vote, Carol said, looking at me with an expression of triumphant pity. Ben Carter stood up. "Thank you, Madam President," he said, his voice smooth and clear. "Mr. Pendleton has asked me to speak on his behalf." Carol's eyes narrowed. "This is a community meeting, not a courtroom. We don't allow outside lawyers." "On the contrary," Ben said, smiling pleasantly. "Your own bylaws, Article 7, Section 3, state that any member may be accompanied by a representative of their choosing at any general meeting. I am his representative." He paused. "You really should read your own bylaws sometime. They're fascinating." A few titters of laughter came from the left side of the room. Carol's face darkened. "Fine, be brief." "I will be," Ben said. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a small projector and a laptop. "But I believe in visual aids." He set up the projector and aimed it at the blank wall behind Carol's head. To address the board's proposal, Ben began as the projector warmed up. "We must first establish a few baseline facts. Madam President, you've spoken at length about a community asset. Let's talk about what actually constitutes community property versus private property." The first image flashed on the wall. It was the certified county plat map, with my property lines highlighted in bright yellow. The location of the spring was marked with a red X. "This is the official plat map for Lot 7B, Ben said, using a laser pointer. "As you can all plainly see, the spring in question is located a full 50 yards inside Mr. Pendleton's legally defined private property. It is not and has never been a community asset. It is as private as his bedroom." Murmurs spread through the room. Ben clicked to the next slide. It was a high-resolution scan of my state water rights certificate. "Furthermore," Ben continued, "the water itself is legally owned. This is State Water Rights Docket G881A, granting Mr. Pendleton exclusive rights to that geothermal source. To suggest the community has a claim to it is like suggesting you have a claim to the oil under your neighbor's land. It is a legal absurdity." He clicked again. A still frame from my phone video appeared on the wall. It was Carol, holding the bolt cutters, her face a mask of aggression. "The board claims it has been met with hostility," Ben said, his voice dropping. "This is a photo from the morning of May 12th, when the president of the HOA was trespassing on Mr. Pendleton's property and attempting to destroy his private property with this." The laser pointer circled the bolt cutters. Mr. Pendleton's response was not hostility. It was to call the authorities. Next slide. A scan of Deputy Miller's official report with the narrative section highlighted. "Trespass warning issued to Carol." Carol stood up. "This is outrageous. This is a violation of my privacy. You can't show that." "It is a public record, Madam President," Ben said coolly. "A record you created with your own actions. Please, sit down. The presentation is not over." She sank back into her chair, her face white with fury. The mood in the room had shifted dramatically. Her supporters were looking confused. The neutral parties were leaning forward, captivated. "Now," Ben said, "let's talk about this conduct detrimental to the community. Let's listen to the president, in her own words, shall we?" He clicked a button on his laptop. The clear, unmistakable audio from George Henderson's microcassette filled the room. Carol's voice, tinny but clear. "We're going to fine him into oblivion. We'll put a lien on his house so fast his head will spin. That spring is going to be the centerpiece of my new wellness program, one way or another. We just have to make an example of him." A collective gasp went through the audience. This was no longer about a dispute over a spring. This was a confession. Mr. Henderson, sitting in the front row, gave a small, satisfied nod. Carol looked as if she had been physically struck. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The mask was not just slipping, it was shattering. And finally, Ben said, his voice now cold and hard, "Let's talk about the proper use of community assets." The president has been very concerned with what she calls hoarding, but perhaps her concern is misplaced. The final slide appeared on the wall. It was a side-by-side comparison of the two financial statements Susan had provided. On the left, the public budget. On the right, the internal budget, with the clubhouse use fees line item highlighted. Below it, a simple spreadsheet showing the income reported versus the income deposited, with a large red number showing the discrepancy, $28, 750 over 18 months. It appears, Ben said, letting the silence stretch, that while our president was so concerned with the community asset in Mr. Pendleton's backyard, she was quietly converting this clubhouse, our actual community asset, into her own personal, for-profit business in direct violation of the original deed of donation. He held up the certified copy of the covenant and, it seems, skimming a substantial portion of the profits for herself. That was it. The collapse. Carol stared at the numbers on the wall, her face completely blank. The confident, imperious mask was gone, replaced by the slack-jawed expression of someone who has just realized the game is over and they have lost everything. The room erupted. People were shouting, pointing, demanding answers. Her two cronies at the head table looked at her, then at the angry faces in the crowd, and visibly shrank away from her. She was alone. She didn't say a word. She just stood up, knocking her chair over, and stumbled out of the room through a side door. The meeting was over. Her reign was over. And it had all been brought down not by an army, but by a quiet man with a set of 3-ring binders and an unshakable belief in the power of the written word. The aftermath was swift and brutal, but I took no joy in it. My goal was never destruction. It was the restoration of order. When the dust settled, the results were comprehensive. An emergency board meeting was held the very next night, without Carol. Susan, the disillusioned insider, presided. A motion was passed to immediately recall Carol as president and as a member of the board. It passed unanimously. A second motion was passed to hire an independent forensic auditor to conduct a full review of the HOA's finances for the past 3 years. That also passed unanimously. A third motion, proposed by a newly emboldened Mr. Henderson, was to rescind every fine Carol had issued from a committee on which she was the sole member. That passed with cheers. Finally, the board voted to pay my legal fees for Ben Carter's services. I had not asked for this, but they insisted. It was a gesture of apology from the community. The auditor's report, when it came out a month later, was devastating. It confirmed everything Susan's documents had suggested, and more. The total amount of embezzled funds was closer to $40,000. The auditor also found that Carol had used HOA funds to pay for the printing of her wellness and lifestyle solutions brochures, and had billed the association for consulting fees paid to her own LLC. It was a tangled, ugly mess of petty graft. Presented with the auditor's report, the board had no choice. They turned the entire file over to the district attorney's office. Carol was charged with multiple counts of felony embezzlement and fraud. Her husband quietly put their house on the market. They were gone within 2 months. I heard later that she took a plea deal, avoiding jail time but receiving a hefty fine, a long period of probation, and an order to pay full restitution to the HOA. On paper, justice was served. The community began to heal. Under Susan's quiet, competent leadership, the HOA returned to its proper function, managing the landscaping contract and organizing the annual potluck. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion evaporated. People started talking to their neighbors again. Mr. Henderson got a check from the HOA, a full refund for every fine he had ever paid, with interest. He used the money to build a beautiful new greenhouse, and this time, he submitted the plans to the new Architectural Review Committee, which was now a group of 3 reasonable residents. They approved it in a day. My life returned to its quiet rhythm, but with a subtle change. I was no longer the strange recluse at the end of the cul-de-sac. I was Arthur, the man who had stood up to Carol. Neighbors who had once avoided my gaze now waved hello. Mrs. Gable, the woman in the bathrobe from that first morning, brought me a plate of cookies as an apology. "I'm so sorry, Arthur," she'd said, her face full of genuine remorse. I had no idea. I just thought, well, she can be very convincing. I accepted her apology and her cookies. They were delicious. I made one final change to the property. I replaced the simple wooden gate at the head of the spring path with a new one, made of heavy wrought iron with a serious, unpickable lock. It was not a hostile gesture, but a clear one. It was a statement of finality. Next to the gate, I commissioned a small, tasteful bronze plaque. I mounted it on a stone pillar. It reads, "The Eleanor Spring, Private Property, Est, 1988. Now, when I stand at my kitchen window at 6:42 a.m., holding my mug of coffee, the view is different. The peace is no longer just a temporary absence of noise. It feels permanent, earned. The steam still rises from the bathhouse vent, a quiet white plume against the dark green of the pines. The new gate stands as a silent, sturdy sentinel. I sometimes think about Carol and her boundless, unearned confidence. She believed so strongly in her own narrative, in her own right to power, that she never bothered to check the facts. She thought the world ran on charisma, intimidation, and the will to dominate. She could not comprehend a world that ran on deeds, plats, and bylaws. She saw my quietness as weakness, my patience as passivity. She had no idea that for some of us, the quietest rooms are where the most important work gets done. She relied on public performance. I relied on private preparation. And in the end, the slow, methodical, boring power of the documented fact will always, always triumph over the loud, chaotic, empty assertions of the performative tyrant. The Eleanor Spring is quiet again. The water is warm. The stars are bright in the night sky when I sit in the soothing heat, looking up through the glass roof. It is a sanctuary, once more, a memorial, and a testament. A testament to the simple, profound idea that a man's home is his castle, but only if he has the original blueprints and a certified copy of the deed. Order has been restored, and that I have found is a deeper and more lasting wellness than anything Carol could ever have conceived. I kept the receipts. On paper, I am at peace.